Hi, and welcome to VIBEZ Daily. This is a daily devotional curated by VIBEZ Church to help you practice the way of Jesus and be all that God has called you to be. You have joined us for our year-long series titled Devoted. Acts 2:42 tells us that the followers of Jesus were devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and to prayer. This podcast was created to provide context and commentary for what you read each day. Just before our friends begin discussing today's reading, we want to invite you not only for fellowship, but for prayer as well. We have created the VIBEZ Daily Chat Group to offer you fellowship and a community where you can state your observations, ask questions about the reading or the podcast. You can join us by downloading the VIBEZ Church app in your favorite app store. Click Join the Conversation and join us today. And finally, we hope that you can join us for prayer. Prayer happens Monday through Friday, and more information on that can be found on the VIBEZ Church app under prayer. Now, let's begin our conversation on today's reading.
Yo, welcome back to the VIBEZ Daily podcast. It is day 141 of our year-long series we have titled Devoted. We are so grateful to have you back with us today. I am glad to be joined by my wife, Victoria, again as we pick up here in a brand new book this week.
Come on, Ezra.
Book of Ezra. Yeah, finally kind of moving forward in the timeline after kind of repeating an entire timeline in 1st and 2nd Chronicles of things that we had already read. Kind of get to move forward a little bit in history. And so, yeah, really excited to talk about Ezra and Nehemiah this week.
Yeah.
As we'll get to 2 different books. But just before we jump into that, we'd love to start with kind of our question or a question just to get our minds going this week. And we are probably about the third way mark, about a third of the way through the Bible. You know, we are making our way. I know, right? There's a lot of pages behind us, making our way in that.
I noticed that the other day. I was like, okay, we putting a dent.
Yeah, we making some progress, but want to look forward a little bit. I'm just curious, what book are you most excited to read? Kind of going forward, you know, we've really read through this probably deeper and slower than we really ever have as far as like getting a little more out of it. So I'm just curious if there's a book that, because of the style and the way we're reading it, that you're really excited to get to.
Yeah. And it's not because it's near the end. I mean, or the end. But it is Revelation.
Okay.
Honestly, that is a book that, like, if I'm totally honest, when I get through like my Bible challenge for like the year, like, oh, I made, to read the Bible throughout the year, I'm normally struggling to make it like my readings by January 1st of the next year, right? And so I feel like I'm rushing, and it just ends up just being, and I'm not an audio person, so it doesn't really work well for me, but like it just becomes audio Bible while I'm driving, been half paying attention just to say I completed it, but I haven't really gone in depth.
Okay. And
every now and then when I look at Revelation, it becomes more and more clear. Then, like, sometimes I just feel like it's scary to like read because there's so many things happening. It's just like, well, what's what? So I'm excited to slow down and read that one. Not because it's the end, because I've actually really been enjoying this. So, how about you?
Yes, that's good. Yeah, I mean, even if it were the end, I think that'd be a good reason.
We did it.
Ready to get to the end here. Actually, it's interesting. I'll probably pick like the Revelation of the Old Testament. I'm excited to look at Ezekiel specifically. Because Ezekiel it's a very interesting book.
Yeah.
It's very different. A lot of imagery, a lot of prophecy.
Yeah.
In Ezekiel. And I think that's one that I also have kind of, I don't say skimmed through, but anytime I've ever done a reading, like a Bible reading plan, particularly like the Bible in 90 days, which is a lot of reading in a little time.
Right.
I haven't been able to just slow down. And so I'll read stuff that I don't understand, but I'm just trying to read it.
Yeah.
Right? And just trying to get through it. And so I don't take the time to slow down because I got a lot of reading to do just to stay on pace. And so, I'm really interested to kind of actually spend time in that, studying it, obviously eventually talk about it, of in this kind of environment and hear more from it. So to me, I feel like Ezekiel is that kind of book. When we get to the books of prophecy in general, there's some interesting things, but I think Ezekiel is the one that's like, what are they talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And we just keep it pushing. All right, next chapter.
Yeah. So That's the one I'm excited for. But as of right now, we're in Ezra and Nehemiah this week. And again, we'll start in the book of Ezra. Fun fact, really, Ezra and Nehemiah were one book up until about 600 years ago. So traditionally, Ezra and Nehemiah were considered one book. They were split up kind of in the 15th century or so to be two books. So the fact that we're reading them all in the same week actually really kind of goes together because the stories do flow into each other. Timeline wise, this takes place after the people of Israel have been exiled, but also now they're returning to their land. So, we start off in verse 1 and it picks up exactly as 2 Chronicles 2 ended, right? So the last verse of 2 Chronicles and the first verse of Ezra are essentially exactly the same. So picks up right where 2 Chronicles leaves off and takes us into timeline wise, again, the people of Israel returning to their land. But we can pick up right there. Again, it picks up at the end of where 2 Chronicles leaves off. King Cyrus of Persia is in charge and kind of gives them permission to return to Jerusalem. What do you think was interesting here in just the way that this book begins?
The first thing that kind of stuck to me was like Persia. I thought Babylon conquered. So even that in itself kind of threw me for a riff of like, okay, wait, what happened to Babylon? And I guess at some point Babylon's gotten conquered by Persia. Yeah. Right? And so I'm just like trying to put the pieces together. I'm like, okay, there must have been a lot of time that has happened, right? 70 years was it?
That's correct.
That has happened between the end or the beginning of their exile, or not exile, the beginning of them being captured, right? And taken from the land to like this point now. And so, I'm trying to even figure out like, okay, so who are going to be these people that come back? Like who's going to make it back? So that was my first thought. But other than that, this king of Persia, Cyrus, in verse 2, really like started this declaration here, and I just was taken aback that like he is proclaiming and professing like the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. Like this acknowledgement that like the kingdoms have come from God, right? Like the kingdoms that he is in charge of has come from God. And he says, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. And in my mind, Persia is like a pagan nation, right? Is not one of the Jewish, tribes. And so I was just thinking like, well, how cool is that though? That like they have been conquering the Jewish people and now the king is even acknowledging who God is. And I'm just like, how sovereign is God that like he has allowed his name and his reverence like to be like identified and respected and reverenced like by these other nations just by capturing his people. So like even the capturing of the people of Judah has like led to this, which was his ultimate goal. He was always going to get the glory out of everything he did anyways, but just to see it happen like this, I was like, okay, respect. That is definitely interesting that, like you said, a pagan or a Gentile or whatever kind of word you want to use, someone that's not Jewish is ultimately who kind of initiates this return to Jerusalem. And, we'll get to it, but like we are going to see that God does not waste the like exile. Like he doesn't waste the time of having his people in Babylon, right? And that kind of season, right? That's a lot of what we read in Daniel is how, Daniel and his friends and some others, how they're influencing the kingdom and are making an impact on those kings and things of that nature, right? So I think it's clear that even though this is a punishment for the people of Israel, God's not like wasting it, right? Like he's still using it for his glory ultimately and still introducing people to him. And
yeah, it's I think the first thing I thought of, and this to me just to kind of like make it somewhat practical, or even just modernize it, is I feel like it reminded me a lot of, in this country, like in its history, we had hundreds of years of enslaved Africans, right, in this country. And for a long time, that was the norm, right, here in this country. And it took free people to essentially take the initiative, right, for the enslaved to become free, right?
Yeah.
Like, it was, as much as I'm sure the enslaved people, they did their best to revolt.
They sure did.
and
they put up a good fight too,
and escape, right? And
they
did
sure
what we
did.
could. It was always going to be a battle and a fight, unless some who were free also stepped forward and said, like, this is wrong and we have to do something about it, right? And I think, like, that's what it reminded me of. It was just like, okay, now you have a people, or a king in this case, who has to be the one to lead and take that initiative to say, hey, let's allow them, to kind of go back. And I think it, to me, is a challenge of, when we are in a place of either authority or privilege or position, like, how are we using that to the benefit of those, that don't have that same opportunity? And again, whether that's even just as simple as in our job as, leaders or managers or owners or whatever the case may be, or in our neighborhoods or in our families, like, how are we using the position that we have, the authority or the opportunity that we have, the privilege that we have to, also give opportunity to those that can't for themselves in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that even when they got this opportunity, like, it was very similar to me once I started reading down to verses like 5 and stuff. That 5 and 6 actually, where it's like, and all who are 6 says, and all who were about them aided them with vessels of gold and silver and stuff. It reminded me of the Exodus of Egypt, where, of course, like you said, some type of higher power had to be like, okay, I'm gonna let y'all go. And it reminded me of how when the Israelites left, that they plundered the Egyptians on their way out. And was given things and given gold and stuff. And so I kind of saw that here too, that this release of these enslaved individuals led to this. But then also, like, I think which was different than we see from Exodus, than that Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh was kind of like, get out, because you just killed my son. And still his heart was hardened. And the difference between Cyrus's heart here is that, like, he was pretty much like, okay, listen, go up please, and rebuild this house of the Lord. Like, rebuild it. Like, he brought the vessels and stuff out of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had put in the house of his, like, pagan temple for his gods. And I mean, he was even just kind of like, okay, listen, so that me and my family goes well for us, like, please go. Please go. Acknowledge this Lord, this God.
No, I think it's good. Like you said, that contrast, or in contrast, was really just got comparison to that Exodus as well. And I mean, again, it just shows God's provision. Like, to me, that, like he said, that he's not gonna send you somewhere or call you to a place that he hasn't already prepared for you in a lot of ways. And so, like, in a similar way to what we said when they were enslaved in Egypt, like, they learned a lot and gained a lot from that ultimately prepared them for, the tabernacle that they were going to build, right? And to have the skills, the labor, the material. And it's a very similar thing. Like I said, it just doesn't seem like God wastes anything. Like, he doesn't waste any season
No.
of our lives, because there's things that we gain from that we're ultimately going to use, for His glory in the future.
Yeah.
Good. Well, this takes us kind of into chapter 2, and I think what's interesting about the way Ezra and Nehemiah read, it's very much kind of a narrative or history account in it, and so a lot of these quote unquote chapters, as they're broken up, are really all one continuous thing in a lot of ways. So there may be some overlap here, but we get in chapter 2 kind of an emphasis on who came back, right, and the descendants and things of that nature. There is an emphasis on the tribes of Judah and Benjamin specifically, and the Levites, right, are who are sent back, right? We get that in chapter 1. Verse 5, as you mentioned, right? The family heads of Judah and Benjamin, along with the priests and Levites, everyone whose spirit God had roused, prepared to go up and rebuild the Lord's house. And so, anything that just jump out to you as you were looking at some of the people who are actually going back, and maybe even some of the numbers associated with it?
Yeah, off top, I actually would think, in my mind, when I was reading this book of Ezra, I always thought that it started with Ezra, and I didn't realize that until now, that oh no, this leader here is actually Zerubbabel. Yeah, and then I was like, Mordecai, is this the same Mordecai? There's not a whole lot of Mordecais up in the Bible. I was like, is this Esther's uncle? You still alive? You're still with us. But so yeah, it's interesting to see his name though. But and then eventually Nehemiah's, right? But that's who eventually, because we know that Nehemiah actually doesn't go until years later, after Zerubbabel and Ezra does. But it's interesting to see their names here. But yes, Zerubbabel being the leader to me is what generally stuck out here, because I was like, oh, hold on, it's not Ezra going up first, it's this guy.
And I think it's just a good thing to point out, right, that as a lot of this is written, it's not necessarily exactly in order, in the sense of I'm reading it in time order, because chapter 2 kind of starts with this summary of hey, these are all the people. They're not saying all these people came first,
right,
or in this order. So as you said, when you mentioned Zerubbabel and Nehemiah and some of these others, not all of them came in that initial wave of people who returned. But yeah, that is just kind of a reference to, okay, these are all those individuals. Let's summarize that as we get into the rest of the story. But
right.
Yeah, anything else just jump out to you in the descendants?
Yeah. Did you check verse 62? That one kind of jumped out to me, where it was kind of oh, these people said that they priests, but we can't find you in these records. That was so funny. But I'm glad that they're diligent, right? They're we're not going to just let anybody come up in here and say that you are descendants of the priests. And the fact that, as we've read, right? We've read Chronicles and stuff like that. They've actually kept a lot of these records. And the fact that, we have them thousands of years later, to me, just says they probably had some records. It was nah, boo-boo, we can't find you for some reason. You're not in there. So, yeah. But I do love the fact that they were just okay, just pause until we can, consult. Yeah, we can consult. Yeah. So. Yeah,
sorry, because I wasn't quite there yet. I mean, some of the names just jumped out to me.
Okay.
Well, just seeing the descendants, right? One of the things I've continued to bring up is God's promise, right? Keeping the descendants of David kind of alive, right? So you see Solomon's servants, you'll see Hezekiah, you kind of see some of these descendants from these different kings. It's all right, these people, they're still living, right? So that then even Asaph's, right? So who's
sons,
was a Levite and whatnot. So just kind of seeing some of those names is interesting to me. But I agree with you that what's significant about verse 62 is it does give speak clearly to, as you said, just the diligence and the precision with which they kind of kept their records,
Mm-hmm.
which, you know, when we can go back to the validity of the Bible and whether we can trust the scriptures as a source of history and of record, even that is like just further support and evidence, right? That they even were like, that they would write down, okay, we got some of these names, but we couldn't confirm them as people who are living at this time. And so we're not going to give them, you know, we're not going to write that down here.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that is so interesting, because they could have just put the names down, but they were just like, nope, unless we can like confirm that that's the case. We're not going to add them to this.
Yeah. And it could have been, to me, they're just words on the page for me, right? So it could have just been like, oh, we're just writing stuff down, just write stuff down. But I guess it shows that this was something of importance. Like, all these names I might just skim through. Like, years later, it doesn't mean much to me. Mm-hmm. But for them, it meant a whole lot.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good. Well, I mean, that from that group that came, there's some offerings that are given kind of at the end of chapter 2. They kind of keep up with that specifically. But chapter 3 really kind of starts with one of the big, I guess, themes of this book, which is ultimately trying to not just rebuild the temple, but reestablish a lot of the practices, right, that they had probably been without, you know, for this time, right, and kind of establish some of what makes them holy and set apart and different, right, as a people, and kind of bring that back. And so in chapter 3, we start with really just kind of even just establishing some of the sacrifices that are offered and festivals and things of that nature. What do you think was interesting in the way that chapter 3 starts?
Yeah, it was. I love that they reference this law of Moses here. Once again, I love the Bible. I was like, yeah, we're not making up laws. We're doing the law of Moses. But then secondly, I love that, like, they said that they started burning these offerings to the Lord morning, evening, night. But, like, even though they were fearful, like, they were doing what they knew was right for the Lord, even though, like, the situation around them with all the people who were probably not happy with them, or whatever the threat was that we learned about, like, that fear was there, but they kept doing it. And I was like, yeah, they probably have to have a lot of courage, because instead they're coming back to a land where, like, other people are living right now. Like, it's not just abandoned. Yeah. And so you're coming, you're claiming the place, you're saying this is our God's, you're rebuilding this temple. People might not be on board with it, but they're like, we're still doing it. And that's what stuck out to me first. And then, of course, they started, like, keeping the festivals and stuff, so.
Yeah.
That was cool.
Good. Yeah. I like that. Yeah, like I said, I don't know, again, outside of just the theme of it, I don't know if there's anything in particular that jumped out kind of in these first few verses, but what I appreciated, at least in the way that it's written, because this is all in kind of the 7th month, and then we're eventually going to get to the 2nd month of the 2nd year, right? So this is kind of all in that first year. I did think it was interesting that they kind of established the practices and, like, the rituals before rebuilding the temple, like that there almost seemed to be a priority on, like, before we build the house of God and God dwells with us, like, let's make sure we got ourselves in order in some way. Actually, I just find that interesting because we've spent a lot of time talking about how we don't necessarily have to be all together before God, comes to dwell with us, or before He answers a prayer, things of that nature. Yeah. But I did think it was interesting that they were trying to essentially prepare themselves and do a lot of these, again, just practices and traditions and things of that nature prior to even starting to build in the temple, which doesn't happen until the 2nd year. But yeah, I mean, when we get to that in verse 8, 2nd month of the 2nd year, Zerubbabel, they start to build the foundation of the temple, specifically. What jumps out to you, kind of starting in verse 8, and you can kind of take that through
Yeah, and what I was going to say about verse 8 kind of ties in with verse 7, actually, where I was really curious on, like, how these people who have not been in this land for a long time start to lay this foundation and do this. But I thought it was really interesting that they went back to, like, I feel like they just kind of, like, went with what they knew. Okay, Solomon reached out to Lebanon for cedars. So, like, so, you know, King Cyrus, I guess, has allowed that to be, that he's requesting on their behalf, like, you know, this stuff to be provided for them, which is, once again, provisional. Like, God is providing for his house. Because they have nothing, but the earthly king, Cyrus, had, like, the means to make this request. And so I thought it was interesting, though, that it was back to the Sidonians and the Tyrians in Lebanon, who they were getting these materials from. But then, like, I just had to just think about it. There's not a lot of people here. Like, before it was like thousands of people. We got hundreds now, like, working on this problem. Remember, it was like 300,000 men or something that was working on Solomon's temple. Like, and now they have like mere hundreds. And so, to me, it was just like, wow, they must have been working hard. Like, really hard, but probably not, like you said, coming up with a lot, which was probably really discouraging, which is why we see this, like, celebration from some in, like, verse 11. Like, we see the celebration, you know, of some, but then the weeping of others, because it's kind of like they're doing their best, and they know they don't have a lot of people, but it's what they got. But then I do love that they have this Psalm of David. This Psalm of David keeps coming up, and so I just love that, like, historically, even here we see this Psalm of David being passed down to generations as their, like, thanksgiving and praise and song that they sing.
Yeah. I mean, the end of 3, you kind of took it over to the end there, that, like, end of 3 has always been, it's actually a random passage that I think I kind of came across. Oh, it's actually had to be a decade ago now. And I can't even tell you how. It's probably just flipping through the Bible and just, like, literally open it up somewhere, which is somewhere close enough to the middle that I probably wasn't landed on it. And read, and I was always blown away by, because that dichotomy between those that remember the old and, like, those that are there celebrating kind of the new, I just thought was so interesting. Because, you know, I can understand that appreciation for how things used to be, right? Because kind of that's what I assume. Like, they're weeping because they just remember it in its glory and its beauty. Maybe it's also some tears of joy and just, like, glad we're back again. But based off the way it's described, it seems like it's more a lamenting of the old, right? That, like, it's always so challenging, because it's like, man, you are so focused on how things used to be that you're just missing, like, what's before you, right? And the opportunity that's coming, and so, like, I feel like it's really challenging to me to try to look forward and try not to focus so much on how things used to be, but to appreciate and be excited for what's to come. But I also thought it was interesting that, like, there were just more who were excited than those that, like, lamented, and that they ultimately drowned them out. And I think that gives encouragement to, like, hey, let's speak up, let's be louder than the naysayers, right? Than the minority of those who aren't excited for what's coming. And I don't know. I've always thought that particular passage was very interesting.
Yeah, and I love this passage because, you know, sometimes we can look at the past and we can lament the past, right? And it's be like, oh, like, it was the good old days, right? But even when you look back, like, into Solomon's time, there was a lot of stuff that was not good happening, right? That, like, you had this beautiful temple. But even Solomon's own heart wasn't for the Lord at that time, right? And all of his wives and all their offspring, and, you know, like, it was in Israel in general, like, their heart wasn't even, like, for God. And so even with this new temple being made with these few little people, at least we know that their hearts were somewhat forgotten, maybe.
Yeah.
And it's kind of hard because, they kind of fall short here and there, as we'll see throughout the text. But and if we never get to, and this was, like you said, this was prophecy from the Lord. So it's a good thing. Coming back out of exile just because the temple's not as great doesn't mean that this isn't part of God's plan.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I don't know if we've had this conversation on the podcast yet, but I know this is something that you and I love to talk about often, right? Because you're right that I think in our personal lives, right, it's just like the enemy to glorify our past, right? And have us just miss kind of how trash it was in so many ways, right? Yes, the temple was beautiful, but it was defiled almost instantly.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And the land itself was defiled, and the people were wilding, and they were trash. They were, and it's they had this glorified view of the past and what the temple used to be, just missing the fact that they were bad. They were wilding, right? And like they said, I know I've had that season. There was definitely that season in my life where I would look back on a season that was really trash. But I remembered it so fondly. Yeah. And I would tell stories. I'd be like, don't forget, I remember when I was this and I did that or whatever. And just forget some of the
garbage.
Just garbage. That it was and how bad it really was. And I'll never forget that moment that all of a sudden I became I felt like God just revealed and just opened my eyes to that life was really not good, and it's not worth celebrating or appreciating or glorifying, right? And so, I feel like it's just they need to do that to us, and I thought it was interesting that they're kind of experiencing a similar thing here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but again, that takes us to 4, and we have 5 chapters today, so we'll get through all chapter 5 here, and not only did they have kind of some of those who missed the old temple, but they end up actually getting some real opposition to building this. This is something that's going to come up a couple times, not just in Ezra, but also in Nehemiah. Man, they get some haters come in and are just don't you know that these people used to rebel against kings and dominate kings? You gonna let them build this temple? You gonna give them an opportunity to start over? And I don't know, it's very interesting to see some of this opposition that happens to building not just the temple, but the city. What jumps out to you here in chapter 4 as they go and snitch to King Artaxerxes?
These people are hilarious to me. They remind me of kids on the playground, bad kids on the playground. I get my way, I ain't gonna tell on you. That's how it's given for me. Because the first verse for me in ESV says the adversaries of Judah, but I know CSB says the enemies, right? So straight up, the author who's writing this is they're not friends, right? And they approach them as if they are. They approach them as if hey, let me build with you. I think it's interesting that they mentioned that this king of Assyria is the one who brought them into the land. Yeah. Which you can tell these are not true Jewish individuals who are solely following the Lord. Yeah. And which reminded me of a verse earlier when we were hearing about them being exiled to Babylon, that there are people who were staying there, people who were brought there, who were brought into the land, and they had a priest or go back to teach them the customs of the land. But I remember it said they worship the Lord, but then they still worship their other gods, right? And so these people, even if they were here and if they did worship God, probably didn't worship God wholeheartedly, right? Or claim him to be their God. And so I think it's so interesting that Zerubbabel and them were straight up no. No, we're not doing that. And that their response though is one of y'all weren't our friends anyways in the first place. Don't try to act like y'all were trying to be friends and bug up with this. I think you're just trying to be nosy actually. in my opinion. But because even of the way that they wrote, like first of all, they wrote to like 3 different kings, right? Like they wrote to Ahasuerus, which I guess
Artaxerxes.
Yeah. Oh, yours says Artaxerxes.
Oh, you're talking about the first one,
verse 6.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So they wrote to him, which I guess his name was also possibly Xerxes, who's also possibly Esther's husband. I'm not sure about all that, but then they write to Artaxerxes. It was like they're just writing letters after letters at this point. Like, who's going to listen to us here? But yeah, they write to them, and like you said, let me know, like, they're rebellious and wicked. Like, I just feel when you talk about people like that, like, you're probably reflecting your own self, like your own heart.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what it felt to me, that like these were not good people trying to call God's people not good.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, it's just like you said, it started with, I love verse 5 kind of says they bribed officials to act against them to frustrate their plans throughout the reign of King Cyrus, right? So Cyrus is kind of who starts it, who sends them out, all the way into the reign of King Darius, right? So there's kind of like this whole time period, they are like opposition, just opposing this building. And so as you said, at first it starts with the beginning of the reign of King Ahasuerus, as you brought up, right? And then it also goes into, as you said, the reign of Artaxerxes, and they're just literally snitching to whomever will listen. And they find the right guy eventually, right? Because Artaxerxes is kind of like, you're kind of right. Like, we shouldn't let them continue.
My taxes. Not my taxes.
Right. Yeah. And so, like, he issues a decree in verse 18, where he's just like, or in verse 19, he issued a decree and a search was conducted. It was discovered that this city has had uprisings against kings since ancient times, and there have been rebellions or revolts in it, right? And so, like, I find it's to me, it's like, just like digging up somebody's past and trying to point out, like, oh, that's why that was justified. You know what I'm saying? Like,
modern day politics.
Real talk, right? Like, we can't trust these people because all you gotta do is go look in their past and figure out what they had done before. And what's crazy about that is, like, man, there's not a person in this world, bro, that you can't, like, find something in their past to hold over their head and say, like, oh man, I can't trust that about them. You know what I'm saying? Like, it was so crazy, especially in the world we live in now with old tweets and Facebook posts and all sorts of stuff, right?
When I was 21.
Videos and pictures, like, it's so easy to go and find something that's quote unquote discriminating, right? Or discriminating, I should say, but and find something that's like, we can't trust them. And it's like, that's literally what they did, man. They just went and searched their tweet history. It was like, yo, Artaxerxes, they should cancel. And he agreed with it. And so, he issues this order for them to stop so the city would not be rebuilt. It's kind of verse 21. And he's like, see that you're not developed, the damage will increase and the word of interest will suffer.
My money.
My money. Stop them forcibly, kind of at the end of chapter 4.
I think it's really interesting, though, because, and I'm sorry, I know we're going to get to this later this week, but I feel like, wasn't Artaxerxes the person who let Nehemiah go back? Yeah, it says in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. Like, Nehemiah was the cupbearer for him. And then he eventually lets Nehemiah go back. I'm just so confused. Like, where do you stand? I guess it's because Nehemiah's going back to repair the walls and not the temple itself. Like, maybe it's something different in his mind, right? But all I know is, like, I'm so confused that, like, okay, he sends his whole letter and says they can't go. But yet, later on, you send Nehemiah and a whole entourage to go. So confused.
Well, I mean, I don't know. Are you able to tell, and this is me, being openly ignorant as we walk through this, like, are you able to tell at what point in Artaxerxes' reign that he writes this letter?
This one?
Yeah.
No, and this one, I don't know. But, you know what, one of my study Bibles has a little timeline. I'm not sure if it, like, says exactly what.
Because I guess it's possible that, like, Nehemiah come back to rebuild the wall before, before they pretty much stopped it, right? Because again, Nehemiah, which we'll get to later, but he has his own opposition too, right? Like, he has, people who are going after him who are, like, also trying to stop it.
Yeah, they have a opposition.
Because you have, let's see, Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, Ammonites, Asherites are kind of who you see in Nehemiah, rather than Ezra, Bishlam, Mithridat, Tabeel, the rest of the colleagues. Like, those are cats that are doing it. So, there's a lot of people who are snitching and trying to stop stuff from happening. But, But what I love, and we'll get to this kind of brings to a close in chapter 5, ultimately, there's a pause, right? It doesn't pick up again until King Darius reigns.
It's like 16 years or something like that. Crazy.
Yeah, so it's a long time that's kind of on hold. But they get to rebuild again after these prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, kind of encourage them. And then when they come, they get snitched on, they essentially send this letter to King Darius. It's pretty much like, yo, go check the records. You want to go back to the history before. Xerxes want to go back to history and hear about, who we used to be and what we used to do. If you're going to do that, go ahead and search the records and see what King Cyrus said, right? Like the decree that King Cyrus put out there years ago. Like, if you're going to do it, go check what he had to say. Because honestly, we got permission to be here, okay? Yeah. We got a permit.
We got permits.
We got a work permit. We got everything we need to get back to work. So, go ahead and search that and, tell me what you find. In the meantime, though, we're going to be out here doing this temple. Like, I don't know. Anything you thought was interesting kind of in 5 here.
Yeah, I love that, though. I love that there was just like, go check Cyrus's history. Don't look at Xerxes. Don't look that he halted us at some point. Just look at Cyrus's.
Because he precedes him.
He does.
Yeah.
And so, I love that. I love how they kind of, wisely left out the other things of being halting and stuff. But then I love how, like, even the people, the officials that rolled up on them and wrote this to, I just love how they, like, reference God. This is like, in verse 8, it says, being known to the king that we went to the province of Judah to the house of the great God. Like, I know they don't have a name for God in the same way that the Jews do, but it's like, this great God, and it's being built, and it's, this is what they're saying to us. And so I love this reverence that we see of God in his house, and that these rumors, right? Like, all we hear is like rumors of this great God and who used to dwell in this land and all this stuff. So
yeah, no, it's good. Like, it's interesting that, like, it is very much a difference between the world that, like, the Israelites lived in versus, like, even the times we live today. And what I mean by that is that, like, those people, they were all theists. Like, they all believed in gods.
right.
And I think a lot of that comes from the less, like, education and things of that nature, right? Where you live in a world that you have to trust God, right? Like, you don't have an irrigation system, so you need rain from the Lord, right?
Who's bringing the rain and the water?
Yeah, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Who's bringing the fertility?
You don't have meteorologists, so, Lord, hold off the, or bring the sunshine, or protect us from the whatever, right? So, like, there was a lot more, one, belief in gods, but also trusting gods. The biggest issue back then was more so, okay, which God was the God, or, can I serve all the gods versus just one of the gods, right? So, like, that was kind of the difference. Whereas nowadays, we have a much larger demographic of people who just don't believe in a God at all, right? It just feels that is foolish. So, to your point, yeah, they definitely acknowledge the God of Israel as a God.
Right.
The issue always just came down to whether he was the God,
or their God.
Or their God, right? They took ownership over him specifically. Yeah, anything else kind of in 5, right? We won't get to Darius' response till tomorrow. Right. But anything else that stuck out to you in chapter 5?
No.
Okay. Well, we'll see how the story ends tomorrow, because Ezra's only 10 chapters. So we'll get through the last 5 tomorrow and see what how it responds and where the temple leaves off before we get into Nehemiah. But again, appreciate you guys joining us today. Hopefully this was helpful. Some context here as we talk through Ezra and Nehemiah this week and get the beginning of that story. But I look forward to you coming back, joining us tomorrow. And until then, take care.
Thank you for joining us for the VIBEZ Daily podcast. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, or download our favorite, the VIBEZ Church app. Visit vibes.church/devoted for additional episodes, notes, details, and the latest merch. Join us next time as we continue our journey through the Bible. Take good care.